You're a Scottish soldier, standing on a muddy field, watching the horizon as 25,000 English warriors march toward you like an unstoppable tide of steel and fury. Your heart pounds as you realize you're outnumbered 3-1. The fate of your entire nation hangs in the balance and there's nowhere to run. What would you do? Would you stand your ground or would fear consume you? This was the exact reality facing Robert the Bruce and his brave warriors at the Battle of Bannockburn, one of the most decisive and dramatic confrontations in all of Scottish history. In the early 1400s, Scotland was fighting tooth and nail to maintain its independence against the mighty English crown. For years, these two nations had been locked in a bitter struggle that would later be known as the Wars of Scottish Independence. The English seemed unstoppable, with their vast resources and seemingly endless armies. Then came June 23rd and 24th, 1314. 2 days that would forever change the course of history. On one side stood King Edward II of England, commanding a colossal army that seemed capable of crushing any resistance. On the other side was Robert the Bruce, a cunning and determined leader with just 9,000 men under his command. But here's what makes this story absolutely fascinating. Sometimes the size of your army matters less than the size of your heart and the sharpness of your mind. What happened during those 2 fateful days near the banks of the Forth River didn't just determine the outcome of a single battle. It shaped the destiny of an entire nation and inspired countless generations who would face their own seemingly impossible odds. The courage, strategy, and sheer determination displayed at Bannockburn would echo through the centuries, proving that even when everything seems lost, the human spirit can triumph against overwhelming adversity. If you're passionate about history and want to uncover the secrets of great empires and legendary battles, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the Medieval Archives channel, and don't miss a single episode of these incredible historical journeys. Now, before we dive into the heart of this incredible story, we need to understand something crucial. Location, location, location. You see, Robert the Bruce wasn't just a brave warrior. He was a master strategist who understood that sometimes winning a battle is less about how many swords you have, and more about where you choose to swing them. Picture Bannockburn, a seemingly quiet spot near the Forth River in Scotland. At first glance, you might think it's just another piece of countryside. But Bruce saw something entirely different when he looked at this land. He saw an opportunity disguised as a challenge. The area was crisscrossed by 2 streams that created something quite fascinating. Boggy, marshy ground that looked solid from a distance, but would quickly turn treacherous underfoot. Now, here's where Bruce's genius really shines through. He knew the English army inside and out. These were soldiers trained for grand, sweeping cavalry charges across open fields where their heavy horses could build momentum and their superior numbers could spread out like a devastating wave. But what happens when you take that same mighty cavalry and force them into narrow, muddy terrain where their horses sink with every step? Suddenly, all those advantages start working against them. The very size that made the English army so intimidating became a liability when they couldn't maneuver properly. Bruce spent time walking this ground, feeling the soil beneath his feet, studying how water moved across the land during different seasons. He wasn't just choosing a battlefield, he was setting a trap. And the most beautiful part? The English would march right into it, thinking they were simply meeting the Scots for another straightforward battle. It's like watching a chess master who's already thinking 5 moves ahead, while his opponent is still deciding which piece to touch first. Now, every great story needs compelling characters, and this one has 2 men whose lives couldn't have been more different. Yet their destinies were about to collide in the most dramatic way possible. On one side, we have Robert the Bruce, the Scottish king who had already lived through more adventures than most people could imagine in 10 lifetimes. This wasn't some pampered royal who sat on a throne giving orders from a safe distance. Bruce had spent years fighting guerrilla campaigns in the Scottish Highlands, sleeping under the stars, eating whatever his men could find, and learning the hard way that survival often depends more on your wits than your wealth. Here's something fascinating about Bruce. He had actually switched sides multiple times during the Scottish Wars. He knew what it felt like to be uncertain, to make mistakes, to question his own decisions. This experience had forged him into someone who understood both victory and defeat intimately. By the time Bannockburn arrived, he had become a leader who could look his men in the eye and say, "Follow me." knowing they would, because he had earned their trust through shared hardship. Now let's talk about Edward II of England. Here was a man who had inherited one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. But inheritance and earning something are two very different things. Edward was intelligent, no doubt about that. But he had never faced the kind of desperate life-or-death situations that had shaped Bruce's character. Edward's father, Edward I, had been nicknamed Longshanks, and was famous for his military prowess and ruthless efficiency. The son, however, was dealing with something his father never had to face: the pressure of living up to a legendary reputation while lacking the same natural talent for warfare. Edward II was more interested in arts and friendships than in the brutal business of medieval combat. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Edward wasn't marching to Bannockburn because he wanted glory or conquest. He was there because he felt he had no choice. His nobles were questioning his authority, his kingdom's reputation was at stake, and he believed that a quick, decisive victory over the Scots would solve all his problems at once. The tragedy is that Edward genuinely thought this would be easy. When you have 25,000 professional soldiers facing 9,000 rebels, the math seems pretty straightforward, doesn't it? But Edward made the classic mistake of confusing numbers with strength and size with strategy. These two men were about to teach each other lessons that neither of them expected to learn. Bruce would discover just how far determination could take him, while Edward would learn that sometimes the crown weighs heaviest when you're not ready to carry it. June 23rd, 1314, the day when everything started to unfold. Picture this. Dawn breaks over the Scottish countryside, and you can almost feel the tension in the air. Both armies know that history is about to be written, but nobody knows yet how the story will end. The Scots didn't wait around for the English to make the first move. Instead, they did something that completely caught Edward's forces off guard. They started what we might call hit-and-run tactics today. Small groups of Scottish warriors would suddenly appear from behind trees or hills, strike hard and fast at the English flanks, then disappear before anyone could properly respond. This wasn't the kind of warfare the English were expecting. They had come prepared for a traditional medieval battle, two armies facing each other in neat formations, charging forward with banners flying and trumpets blaring. Instead, they found themselves dealing with what felt like ghosts, who would materialize just long enough to cause chaos, then vanish back into the landscape they knew so well. But here's where the story takes an absolutely incredible turn. Late in the day, a single English knight named Henry de Bohun spotted Robert the Bruce riding ahead of the main Scottish force. Now, de Bohun was no ordinary soldier. He was a seasoned warrior from one of England's most prestigious families, mounted on a powerful war horse and armed with a long lance. When de Bohun saw Bruce, he must have thought he'd been handed the chance of a lifetime. Imagine it. Kill the Scottish king in single combat, and the entire rebellion collapses in one stroke. He spurred his horse forward, lowering his lance for what he surely believed would be the decisive moment of the entire war. Robert the Bruce saw him coming. Now Bruce was mounted on a smaller horse, a sturdy Scottish pony, and he carried no lance, just a battle axe. By all conventional military thinking, he was at a severe disadvantage. The smart thing would have been to retreat, to let his men handle this threat. But Bruce made a choice that would echo through centuries. As de Bohun thundered toward him, Bruce calmly guided his horse to one side at the last possible moment. As the English knight's lance passed harmlessly by, Bruce raised his battle axe and brought it down with devastating precision. The blow was so powerful that it split de Bohun's helmet and skull, killing him instantly. What happened next is something you have to understand to grasp the full impact of this moment. The entire Scottish army had been watching this encounter. When they saw their king not only survive but triumph in such spectacular fashion, something electric passed through their ranks. These weren't professional soldiers like the English. Many were farmers, craftsmen, ordinary people who had taken up arms to defend their homeland. Seeing Bruce face down a heavily armored knight and win through skill and courage alone transformed their fear into something much more powerful: absolute faith in their leader and their cause. The English, meanwhile, watched one of their finest warriors fall to what they had dismissed as a ragtag rebel army. The psychological impact of this single combat was enormous. It sent a clear message. The Scots weren't just going to roll over and surrender. They were here to fight, and their king was willing to risk everything right alongside them. So there you have it. Did you know that the Scots used psychological tactics like this to gain the upper hand? If you're enjoying this incredible historical journey, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with fellow history lovers, and subscribe to the Medieval Archives for more amazing stories from the past. And here's a question for you. Drop a comment below and tell us, what do you think would have happened if Edward II had been a more experienced military commander? Would the outcome have been different? Dawn broke on June 24th, and everyone knew this would be the day that decided everything. The first day had been like a boxing match where the fighters were still feeling each other out. Now, it was time for the main event. Edward II woke up that morning convinced he could still turn things around. Yes, the previous day hadn't gone exactly as planned, but he still had overwhelming numbers. He still had the finest heavy cavalry in Europe. Surely, he thought, one massive charge would scatter these Scottish rebels like leaves in the wind. But remember that marshy ground we talked about earlier? Well, overnight, something crucial had happened. The English army, trying to position themselves for what they believed would be a decisive attack, had maneuvered themselves into exactly the trap that Bruce had been hoping for. They found themselves squeezed between those two streams, with boggy, unstable ground beneath their feet. Imagine trying to run a race while wearing heavy boots in thick mud. That's essentially what the English cavalry was about to attempt. These weren't just any horses either. These were massive war horses, bred for size and power, carrying knights in full armor that could weigh as much as a small car. On firm ground, they were unstoppable. On soft, marshy terrain, they became liabilities. Now, here's where Robert the Bruce showed his true genius as a military commander. Instead of trying to match the English in traditional cavalry charges, he organized his men into something called schiltrons. Picture a circle of Scottish warriors, each holding a long spear pointed outward, like a giant porcupine made of steel and determination. These formations had been used before, but Bruce perfected them in a way that was absolutely brilliant. When the English knights charged, expecting to break through Scottish lines as they had done countless times before, they instead found themselves facing walls of spear points that their horses simply couldn't penetrate. Worse yet, the muddy ground meant their horses couldn't build up the speed and momentum that made cavalry charges so devastating. What followed was something that nobody on the English side had expected. Instead of the Scots breaking and running, it was the English formations that began to collapse. Knights found themselves unhorsed and struggling in the mud, their heavy armor now working against them instead of protecting them. The very size of their army became a problem as units bumped into each other, unable to maneuver in the tight space between the streams. But Bruce had one more trick up his sleeve, and this one was pure psychological warfare at its finest. At the height of the battle, when the English were already struggling and starting to panic, the Scots did something absolutely brilliant. They had arranged for their camp followers, the cooks, servants, and other non-combatants, to appear on a nearby hill carrying banners and making as much noise as possible. To the exhausted and increasingly desperate English soldiers, this looked like a massive Scottish reinforcement, arriving just when they needed it most. The reality was quite different. These were mostly ordinary people with kitchen knives and farming tools, but in the chaos and confusion of battle, appearances were everything. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. English soldiers who had been fighting desperately suddenly believed they were about to be overwhelmed by fresh Scottish troops. Panic spread through their ranks like wildfire. What had been an organized retreat quickly became a complete rout. King Edward himself, realizing that the day was lost, and that staying would likely mean capture or death, made the difficult decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He left the battlefield, abandoning thousands of his soldiers to their fate as he fled back toward England. The victory was so complete that it shocked everyone, including the Scots themselves. In just 2 days, a small army of determined rebels had defeated one of the most powerful military forces in medieval Europe, using nothing but clever tactics, intimate knowledge of their homeland, and the kind of courage that comes from fighting for something you believe in more than life itself. So what happened after the dust settled and the cheering died down? Well, that's where this story gets really interesting. because the Battle of Bannockburn didn't just end a conflict. It changed the entire course of Scottish history and created ripples that are still felt today. First, let's talk about what this victory meant for Robert the Bruce personally. Before Bannockburn, Bruce was essentially a rebel leader with a shaky claim to the Scottish throne. Sure, he called himself king, but plenty of people, both in Scotland and beyond, saw him as just another troublemaker fighting a hopeless cause. After Bannockburn, everything changed. The victory gave Bruce something that no amount of royal blood or political maneuvering could provide: undeniable proof that he could lead Scotland to triumph against impossible odds. Scottish nobles who had been sitting on the fence waiting to see which way the wind would blow suddenly found themselves eager to pledge their loyalty to the man who had humbled the mighty English army. But here's something fascinating that often gets overlooked. The battle didn't just make Bruce a legitimate king in the eyes of his own people, it forced the rest of Europe to take notice. Medieval politics was all about respect and reputation, and nothing earned respect quite like defeating a major power in battle. Suddenly, other kingdoms started treating Scotland as a serious player rather than England's rebellious northern province. However, and this is crucial to understand, the English didn't just pack up and go home after Bannockburn. Edward II was humiliated, but England as a nation was far from defeated. The war continued, with raids and counter-raids across the border, diplomatic maneuvering and ongoing tension that would simmer for years to come. It wasn't until 1328, a full 14 years after Bannockburn, that England finally, officially recognized Scottish independence through the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton. Think about that for a moment. 14 years of continued struggle after what seemed like a decisive victory. It shows you just how stubborn medieval politics could be, and how even the most spectacular military triumph doesn't always translate into immediate political success. But here's where the story becomes truly remarkable. The victory at Bannockburn did something that military conquests rarely achieve. It created a lasting sense of national identity that transcended the immediate political situation. Before this battle, Scotland was more of a collection of competing clans and regions than a unified nation. The shared experience of this incredible victory against overwhelming odds helped forge something new, a distinctly Scottish sense of pride and independence. This battle became the foundation story that Scots would tell their children and grandchildren. It proved that size and wealth didn't always determine the winner, that clever strategy and unshakable determination could triumph over brute force. When future generations of Scots faced their own challenges, and there would be many, they could look back to Bannockburn and say, "If our ancestors could do that, what can't we accomplish?" The battle also established a template for Scottish resistance that would echo through the centuries. The idea that a smaller, determined force could use knowledge of local terrain, unconventional tactics, and sheer willpower to defeat a larger, more conventional enemy became part of the Scottish national character. Perhaps most importantly, Bannockburn proved that independence wasn't just a dream. It was an achievable goal worth fighting for. The victory showed that England, despite all its power and resources, wasn't invincible. This realization would inspire not just Scots, but people in many other places who found themselves under the rule of distant powers they didn't choose. Even today, when you visit Scotland, you'll find monuments and memorials to Bannockburn, not just as a military victory, but as a symbol of what's possible when people refuse to accept that their situation is hopeless. The battle became proof that sometimes, just sometimes, David really can defeat Goliath. So here we are, at the end of this incredible journey through one of history's most remarkable underdog victories. When you really think about it, the Battle of Bannockburn was so much more than just another medieval clash between two armies. It was a testament to something fundamental about the human spirit, our ability to face impossible odds and somehow find a way to prevail. Robert the Bruce and his 9,000 warriors didn't win because they had better weapons or more soldiers. They didn't triumph because they were stronger or richer than their enemies. They won because they understood something that their opponents had forgotten, that when you're fighting for your home, your freedom, and your future, you discover reserves of strength and creativity that you never knew existed. Think about Bruce's journey for a moment. This was a man who had made mistakes, who had switched sides, who had doubted himself and been doubted by others. Yet when the moment came that would define not just his own fate but the destiny of an entire nation, he found within himself the courage to face a knight in single combat and the wisdom to turn a muddy field into a trap for his enemies. What's truly inspiring about this story is how it shows us that victory doesn't always go to the biggest, or the loudest, or the most obvious choice. Sometimes it goes to the one who thinks differently, who sees possibilities where others see only problems, who refuses to accept that the current situation is permanent. The Scots at Bannockburn teach us that preparation matters. Bruce didn't just get lucky with that terrain, he studied it and planned for it. They show us that leadership means being willing to take the same risks you ask others to take. Bruce could have stayed safely behind his lines, but instead, he rode out to face de Bohun personally. And they demonstrate that sometimes the most powerful weapon you have is the element of surprise and the willingness to do what nobody expects. But perhaps most importantly, this battle reminds us that the struggles we face today aren't so different from the ones people have always faced. We all have moments when we feel outnumbered, when the odds seem stacked against us, when giving up looks like the only reasonable option. The story of Bannockburn whispers to us across the centuries that those moments are exactly when we need to dig deeper, think smarter, and remember that history is full of people who were told something was impossible right up until the moment they proved everyone wrong. So I'll ask you the same question that Robert the Bruce might have asked his men on the morning of June 24th. When you're facing your own impossible situation, what will you choose? Will you be defeated by the size of the challenge, or will you be inspired by the possibility of what you might accomplish if you refuse to give up? If this incredible story of courage, strategy, and determination has touched something in you, I'd love for you to share that feeling with others. Hit that like button to let me know this resonated with you. Share this video with friends who could use a reminder about what's possible when we refuse to accept defeat. And make sure to subscribe to the Medieval Archives so you won't miss any of our future journeys into the remarkable stories that shaped our world. The past is full of lessons for those brave enough to listen, and I can't wait to explore more of them with you. Until our next historical adventure, remember, sometimes the most important battles are won, not by the strongest, but by those who refuse to surrender their dreams.